Before we look at those, what I want to do is zoom out to talk about the nature of medicine and within our tradition. You need to know that medicine has absolutely exploded over the last 100 or so years, especially over the last 50 years, in terms of what medicine knows about our bodies and what it knows about and what it can do for us. Just to give you a sense of that, life expectancy in the United States in 1900 was around 45, and in 2000 it was about 76. Right now, so within 100 years, we simply live much longer. Most of that is not what you read about in the newspapers. Most of that is public health measures, things like vaccinations, things like indoor plumbing. My wife and I were at a conference in southern India, and you saw these open sewage pits with flies all over the place, and you sort of wonder why people are not sicker than they are. Some of it is public education, washing your hands before meals, after you go to the bathroom. Don't smoke, don't abuse drugs or alcohol, right? A lot of that is public education. Some of it is law. The fact that you can't smoke in Los Angeles, even on Venice Beach, right, makes it very inconvenient and also very expensive. The taxes that it was Proposition 69 or something a while ago that added to the cost of cigarettes, so that to use for these kinds of public announcements, on television and so on, about the problems with smoking and drug abuse at Low. And the second most important factor in that was antibiotics and the fact that we live much longer. But penicillin was discovered. Anyone have an idea? 1939. Well, it was actually 1928, but then rediscovered in 38 or 39. And it was only because Roosevelt knew that it was really important that he got drug companies together to mass produce them for the troops in World War II. But doctors did not know how to use them in pregnancy-related issues. So I was born in 1943. I'm 79. You don't have to do the math. The 2 years after I was born, my mother was pregnant. The baby died in utero in the 6th month, but they didn't know how to use antibiotics for C-sections. So they had her carry to term, and she delivered a stillborn, which in the meantime had poisoned her renal system, her kidneys. So she was bedridden for 2 years, and my sister was adopted because she was told that she dare not get pregnant again. That was 1945 in this country, right? It wasn't until the late 40s, early 50s that they knew how to use antibiotics in C-sections. And then only in a tertiary way, in terms of why we live much longer, are things like organ transplants and the like, right? Where in ancient times, our ancestors were pretty good at preventive medicine. They knew, I mean, there are texts that tell us that you shouldn't eat too much meat. You should eat fruits and vegetables. You should exercise. You should get enough sleep. By the way, Americans are the most sleep-deprived society in the world, and we suffer from that a lot in terms of cortisol levels, blood pressure levels, and the like, right? 8 hours of sleep a night, ladies and gentlemen, right? More or less. So, I mean, the rabbis already knew about that. And you get that in both and you even get in the Bible itself, which we read a week or two ago, quarantine, right? Which, 1955, I got measles, and the Milwaukee County Health Department came and quarantined our house, and my sister and I were stuck there for a month, and I had a terrible case of it. She got 3 bumps. I'm yet to forgive her for that. But anyway, I'm just kidding. And 2 years later, I got chickenpox, the same thing, because the vaccine for measles was not around until 1963, right? For chickenpox until 1993, right? And still to this day, some of the college students that I teach usually have been vaccinated for measles, but not for chickenpox. But those kinds of things they didn't have, right? But they did have the sense that you quarantine people who have communicable diseases. So those kinds of preventive measures, they were pretty good at. But curative things were terrible. The only things that they tried, they had a sense that a lot of diseases were bloodborne. So they would take some blood from people who had diseases. It turns out that that's good for only one disease, which happened, my mother happened to have had it, namely polycythemia. You have too many red blood corpuscles. And still to this day, what you do is you take a pint of blood every once in a while, and that's that. You have it around? Yeah, me too. Anyway, but that's the only disease for which that works. And the other thing they did, some of you may remember the movie Dances with Wolves, right? And the opening scene, remember it takes place during the Civil War, right? Kevin Costner is brought to the sick bay, he's got a leg injury, and they showed what they actually did then. They got him drunk, which was anesthesia, right? And then you get people to hold him down and literally saw it off the leg. And if the person didn't die of loss of blood, they would die of infections. And so Kevin Costner runs away and the rest of the movie happens. But that's all they had really was bloodletting and surgery. But they were able to at least observe things. And so when we talk about things like the status of the fetus, they clearly did not have sonograms or anything like that. But yet the rabbis already know that in the first 40 days of pregnancy, a fetus looks like simply liquid. And then from the 40th day on, the Talmud says it looks like the thigh of its mother. So where does that come from? So first of all, you have to know what 40 days means. 40 days from when? The gynecologists, obstetricians count from the last period that the woman had, right? That leads to a 40-week pregnancy. The geneticists count from the moment of conception, which is about a 38-week pregnancy. The rabbis were counting from the first period she missed. So 40 days is roughly 54 days of gestation. I was on a commission for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and this is back in the early 2000s, and we were being taught about embryonic stem cell research and things like that, right? And we were being taught by one of the two doctors that had identified embryonic stem cells and not Jewish. And at one point during a coffee break, I went up to him and I said, what would a fetus look like around 54 days of gestation? And he said, well, it would look like a thigh. And I almost dropped my coffee, right? And I said to him, that's what the rabbis say. Why did you say that? So he said, well, it's around 54 days of gestation that if there's a miscarriage, it would be, by that time you get a bone as well as flesh and some hair. And since it would come from the vaginal area of the woman's body, I said it was like a thigh. So the rabbis at least had a sense of, and if the woman miscarried in the first 2 months of pregnancy, it would simply be a very strong menstrual flow, right? Because they would not know, they certainly didn't know about eggs. By the way, when were ova first identified? Human ova? 1827, right? The presumption was throughout the Middle Ages into our own time that when a man ejaculated, the homunculus was inserted into the woman's uterus, right, where it was gestated, and then ultimately the baby was born. Now, how they understood why some children look like their mothers, I don't know. Okay. But the point is that just to give you a sense of the fact that this is just a matter of the status of medicine, in the ancient world into the modern world, that has really radically changed. That said, they did observe things. And in what we're talking about today, they identify several different categories. One of them is the androgynous, described as a person whose body neither is typically male nor typically female, but had anatomic features of both. Was likely what we refer to as a person with ambiguous genitalia or intersex, right? The meaning of tum-tum, which is another category that they use, is a person who is either male or female, but whose gender is unknown, because the organs are hidden by some type of membrane or cover, and they're obscure. A saris is a third category that they observed, or a saris chama, a man congenitally sterile, either because he has undescended testes or some others, or some febrile illness or something on that order, right? But they identified a man who was congenitally sterile. On the other end, an Iyun is a woman who was congenitally sterile, and maybe it's at least some claim that it's a female sex reversal, a person with male genetic makeup and typical female genitalia. That may be the Iyunite. And in any case, these terms are terms that we're just now guessing as to what they really were. But it is the case that the fact that the rabbinic literature has these terms indicates that they were observing, even though they lived in a primarily binary universe. In other words, they presumed you're either male or female. They observed the fact that that was not always the case. And they didn't, and so the question that they had, again, they didn't know about transgender surgery. They didn't know about anything like that. Didn't know, hormonal treatments, none of that, right? But the question that they had is, well, what do we do with these people legally, right? In other words, how do they, and that's what this Mishnah is about. Now, by the way, when I printed this out, I just took it from Svaria, and I didn't notice that. I don't know how this happened. The Hebrew doesn't match the English. But in any case, if you want to look it up, you can look up. This is what just came out of Svaria. But by and large, the Hebrew is correct. The English, I think, adds a lot to what's not here. But anyway, here we go. Androgynous yesh bo drachim shavel anashim, v'yesh bo drachim shavel anashim. They're, for an androgynous, the hermaphrodite, right, is in some ways like men and in other ways like women. V'yesh bo drachim shavel anashim v'nashim. And there are ways in which they are similar to just people generally. Okay? V'yesh bo drachim she'ino shavel lo anashim v'lo anashim. There are ways in which they're not similar to either men or women. So then the next four Mishnayot describe each of these four categories. Okay, Ketzad shavel anashim. How are they like men? Metamei beloven kanashim. If they have a semen discharge, then they become impure for the day. When a man has an ejaculation, then he is impure until sunset, and then the next day. This is Leviticus 15, if you want to take a look at this stuff, and which means he can't go into the temple precincts and things like that, right? For the day, the v'zokek l'yibum kanashim, and he would need yibum. Yibum is levirate marriage, right? If if his brother dies and without children, then he has to marry the widow in order to have children on behalf of the deceased brother. If he can wrap in clothing, in male clothing, and similarly have haircuts like men. He can marry a person, but not be married by men, right? And like men, he's responsible for all of the commandments of the Torah. Women are exempted from about 20 of them, right? So like men, the androgynous is responsible for all of them. Ketzad shavel anashim, number 3, metamei v'oden kanashim. So he becomes impure if he has a blood discharge. Odin is red, right? Adam, right? Adam. So if he has a blood discharge, he is metamei, as women are. And what does that mean? When a woman has her menstrual flow, she's tamei. She's tameah for how long? During the menstrual flow and for a few days thereafter. So it's usually about 10 to 12 days, depending upon which rabbi you're reading. Okay. Ve'eno mitached im hanashim kanashim, and she doesn't doesn't become one, in other words, have sexual intercourse with men as women do. Ve'eno, so because she's like a woman in that way. Ve'eno over al bal takith ve'al bal tashchit, and she cannot possibly violate the laws of bal takith. Takith means to shave the corners of your head, here, and there, right? That's the way that this comes from Leviticus, right? And velomatame lamatim kanashim. So if she happens to be the child of a Kohen, right? The Kohen is not allowed to go to a funeral for people other than their immediate relatives, okay, and unless they, well, rabbis who are Kohanim do all kinds of things and are observant, let's say, or, make all kinds of arrangements at funerals in order to be able to officiate at funerals. Ufasul min ha'idut kanashim, and they cannot give testimony the way that women cannot give testimony. So in that way, the androgynous is like a woman. Don't tell me, that's a long story, but anyway, they know nival ba'avira kanashim, and they cannot be sexually. They cannot be the passive partner in a sexual encounter the way that women can be. And they cannot be kohanim, okay, as women cannot be. All right, next paragraph on the opposite side of the page. Yeah, please.
I just missed it. I didn't hear you make reference to Baltashki, because we probably understand it in what Judaism says about environmental issues. I just missed it.
But environmental issues?
No, Baltashki is here.
Oh, the Baltashki. Yeah, the Baltashki is, yeah, because I missed that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Because that part of it is in Deuteronomy 20, in which talking about men going to war. And then when they're going to war, they may not cut down fruit trees. So it's only men that are responsible for Baal Tashkit, at least as this Mishnah has it, and not women. Yes.
The first paragraph is how the hermaphrodite is like a man. The second is how he or she or they or whatever is like a woman.
Right.
But I need to read them together, right?
Yes, that's right. And you need to read them with also 4 and 5, ways in which they're not like either men or like women.
Okay, so I'm confused because if you're going to discharge semen, that means you have a penis.
Right.
And if you're going to discharge blood, it means you're going to have a vagina.
Right.
So the person has both.
Right.
I mean, you have to have both if you're going to do both of these.
Right.
And then, however, the person can only marry women.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Which sort of makes sense because rabbinic literature doesn't really care about women.
Well, it's not so much that, but well, that's a very forceful way of putting it. What I would say is that there is in Leviticus 18 and 20 a prohibition against 2 men having sex together. There's no Torah prohibition against 2 women having sex together. So that became later in rabbinic literature, right? So they're less worried about 2 women having sex together than they are about 2 men having. Yes, it fits in with that. That's right. That's right. Good. Yeah. Either one.
I'll say I'm just gonna wait. When it starts off and says, in other ways, like a man, like a woman, other ways not, I would have expected that I would hear ways in which the person is like, really like, but instead what we're getting, which is not surprising given the context, is ways in which they're treated
Yes,
by Jewish law.
that's correct.
I mean, it's an interesting kind of maneuver.
Right. Well, and that's what I was saying at the beginning. Because they couldn't deal with these people medically in any way, right? Their only real questions were legal questions. Namely, how do we categorize them in terms of in terms of their legal status? So that's why. Right. Right. So this is typical rabbinic stuff. Right. You were next.
So also kind of picking up on Michelle's question or comment, so one perspective is that perhaps there's concern around the prohibition against male homoerotic behavior.
Right.
But is there also an added sense of the possibility of pregnancy and brewer that's built into this as a positive?
I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're right. Yes. Because again, they don't really know what this is. Right. And they don't know what is possible. They don't know whether these people can become pregnant. They don't know whether these people can impregnate. They just don't. It violates the typical binary categories that they're used to. So, and again, medically, they don't really know what to do here. Right. So they imagine that all of these things could happen, and they're trying to identify legally what the status is of these possibilities. Yeah. Yes.
You have 5 more minutes.
I have 5 more minutes. Let me just do these 2 things. All right. And then okay. Number 4. How are they like all other people? In the same sort of a way, they are responsible, both as men and as women are, for any assault that they do, and also for cursing that they do. If they curse their parents, remember in Exodus chapter 21, and if he kills somebody by accident, then he is exiled to the cities of refuge. But if he does it by intentionally, then he is executed the way that both men and women are if they intentionally murder. V'yoshevet alav dam tamei v'dam tahor kanoshim v'nashim, and they have to observe if they have if they have some kind of a blood emission, then they have to observe the laws of being tamei and not becoming tahor, like both men and women. So for a man, it's just until sunset. For a woman, it's for 12 days, let's say, right? And they take part in the sacrifices the way that both men and women do. In other words, if they bring todah, let's say Thanksgiving offering, then they get a part of the offering to eat. And the same sort that would be true for both men and women, and also be true for an androgynous. And they can also inherit in the same way that both men and women can inherit property. Ve'imamar hareini nazir shezeh ish v'isha harei nazir, and he can become here. The androgynous can become a nazir with all the special the particular vows that they take on. Number 5, in what ways are they not like either men or women? People who assault them are not responsible because they don't know, because the law doesn't know. In order to assault in order to be liable for assault, you have to assault a person, and they don't know what kind of a person this is. Ooh is right. This is not Elliot Dorff talking. This is this is the Mishnah, right? In other words, if somebody curses them, then that person is not liable. Okay, and they're not evaluated. If the Leviticus 27, at the end, in Leviticus 27, if a person has an evaluation for purposes of the temple, if I vow my value to the temple, how much is that? And that depends upon, if I'm male or female, it depends upon my age also, right? So, but they don't have that because they don't know whether they're male or female. They may know the age of the person, but they don't know whether they're male or female. But if he says, I'm going to be a nazir, but not like a man or a woman, then he's not a nazir. He's got to be a nazir according to one or the other of them. Now, notice this, Rabbi Meir Omer, but if you look at the translation, Rabbi Yossi says, so the whole thing is whatever. But Rabbi Meir Omer, androgynous bria bifnei atzmahu. An androgynous is an animal of its own sort, right? V'lo yachlu chachamim lahachriya alav imhu ish or isha. And the chachamim could not tell whether he's a man or a woman. Aval tumtum no kain, but a tumtum is not so. Pamim shehu ish, pamim shehu isha. So according to Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yossi, whichever, right? This whole thing about the androgynous is just it may be what the rest of the rabbis say about the legal status of the androgynous, but I, Rabbi Meir, think that it's just too ambiguous, and we don't know how to deal with this legally. But a tumtum, somebody who doesn't have clear genitalia, that sometimes he's like a man and sometimes he's like a woman, without explaining how.
That's
Okay.
Thank you.